On Tuesday, I received these graphics cards, shiny new NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1660s, and although they're launched today, Thursday was somewhat expected since the 1660 Ti already debuted last month. Starting price of $220 for entry-level add-in board versions of the 1660 should make it very appealing to a lot of gamers out there. It still has 6 gigs of VRAM, although it is slower GDDR5, and it will only be available in third-party add-in board variants like these, the GTX 1660 Gaming X from MSI, the GTX 1660 XC from EVGA, and the GTX 1660 WindForce OC from Gigabyte.
Excellent!
The Corsair One is a gaming PC for people who want maximum performance with a minimal footprint. Don't let the size fool you though, there's a Core i9-9900K CPU and an RTX 2080 Ti in the Corsair One i160, kept chilly with convection assisted cooling and separate closed loops for the CPU and GPU. There's also a Corsair One i140 with an i7-9700K and an RTX 2080, so click the sponsor link in the video description to learn more. So what's the difference between a GTX 1660 and a GTX 1660 Ti? They are both based on the 12nm Turing TU116 GPU, which does not include RTX capabilities, so no RT cores, no hardware support for ray tracing or DLSS like you get with RTX cards, which honestly isn't a huge loss in my opinion. So the main difference is fewer streaming multiprocessor units and CUDA cores. 22 SMs on the 1660 versus 24 on the Ti, 1408 CUDA cores down from 1536 on the Ti, and then you have slower 8,000 MHz effective GDDR5 VRAM on the 1660 versus faster 12,000 MHz effective GDDR6 on the Ti. In either case, the GPU has 6 32-bit memory controllers for a 192-bit bus, and the default base and boost clock are also a bit faster on the 1660 at 1530 and 1785 MHz respectively, as compared to the Ti, which starts at a base clock of 1500 and a boost of 1770. So all of these cards I have here are manufacturer overclocked versions with boost clocks bumped up to 1830. Supplemental board power is provided by an 8-pin PCI Express graphics power connector, and my Gigabyte and MSI cards have 3 DisplayPort 1.4 outs and 1 HDMI 2.0B, and then the EVGA goes with NVIDIA's reference specs for video outs, which is 1 HDMI, 1 DisplayPort, and 1 DVI. These cards do not have USB Type-C for virtual link support, but board partners do have the option to add that if they want. So speaking of these 3 cards, they all have their unique qualities, starting with the EVGA 1660 XC, which is actually a 3-slot card. This allows it to stay pretty short and only about 7.5 inches long, but there is a big fat fin stack underneath that cooler thanks to the 3rd slot. We also have a single cooling fan and unfortunately no backplate. So I think this card would be great for some mini ITX builds where card length can be an issue, but definitely not actually for some mini ITX builds where the 3rd slot might conflict with the power supply, which is the case in a lot of smaller cases out there. So just bear in mind when you're picking your case, if you go with this card, that it is a slightly different form factor, although I applaud EVGA for going for something that's a little bit more different and unique. This one's going to go for $230, which is $10 more than the base price for the 1660, but EVGA said there will also be a $10 mail-in rebate available at launch. The MSI Ventus XS is next, and this will also be a $230 GTX 1660. MSI has gone with a 2-slot design for this one, and they have also added a backplate, which is plastic, but I actually think it looks quite nice. Not bad, at least, for a plastic backplate. It's got sort of a faux brushed metal finish, and it kind of wraps around to meet up with the shroud that is on the heatsink, which also sports a single copper heat pipe and a 2-fan cooler. This card measures at 8 inches long, so still pretty short and pretty compact, and again, just an 8-pin PCI Express power connector. Finally, we have the Gigabyte GTX 1660 WindForce OC, and this one will sell for the MSRP of $220, and it's a 2-slot design, much like the MSI. It does come in a bit longer at about 8 7/8 inches long, but that's still about an inch shorter than the width of most standard ATX motherboards, so I think in most systems that length isn't going to be a conflict issue. It does also have a wraparound backplate on the back with a Gigabyte logo and a bit of 3D texture that also kind of matches up with the shroud on the front, so I thought that was a pretty nice design. And again, we have an aluminum fin stack with a single copper heat pipe providing some extra heat dissipation from the GPU. Now lastly, I wanted to point out card height, or the amount of height that's above the PCI Express bracket, and for that one, the EVGA actually comes in as the shortest
The Gigabyte would be a bit in the middle. It is a bit taller than the bracket, but then the MSI one is definitely the tallest of the three. So my first order of business for testing is to see which of these three cards I like the best to do further testing to compare against the other benchmarks that I have. To do this, I set up two tests: the 3DMark Time Spy burn-in test that loops for about 20 minutes to get a measure of temperature as well as clock speeds, and then the Firestrike Ultra run so I can get some scores that I can compare against each other. These are all using the same GPU, so the differentiating factors should be those operating temperatures and sustained clock speeds. Also bear in mind when it comes to base and boost clock speeds, all three of these, at least according to GPU-Z, were running at the same frequency: 1530 base clock, 1830 boost clock. The EVGA GTX 1660 XC hit an average temperature of 70 degrees Celsius, a max temperature of 74 degrees Celsius, average clock speed of about 1854, and a max clock speed of 1965. System power draw during the Time Spy burning test was 184 watts on average, and then when I ran 3DMark Firestrike Ultra, the graphics score was 2742. MSI GTX 1660 Ventus XS had an average temperature of 70 and a max temp of 74, pretty much the same temps as the EVGA card. Average clock speed was 1858, just a few ticks faster, and the max clock speed was 1965, exactly the same. System power draw was actually a little bit less at 178 watts, and the 3DMark Firestrike Ultra graphics score was 2741. Finally, the Gigabyte GTX 1660 WindForce OC had an average temperature of 68 degrees, which was the coolest of the three, max temp of 74, which was identical to the other two, average clock speed of 1856, which was right in between, max clock speed of 1995, which gives it the win for max clock speed, system power draw of 181 watts, and then a 3DMark Firestrike Ultra graphics score of 2763. All of these are within a margin of error of each other, and I'm not going to say that one of these cards is necessarily better than the others because the scores were so close, but given the three results that I have, I'm going to go with the Gigabyte card for further testing. So for those benchmarks I just talked about and the upcoming ones, all of them were run on the test system, which is back there in the corner, which features an Intel Core i9-9900K running at 4.8 GHz, an ASRock Z390 Taichi Ultimate motherboard, a Cooler Master ML360R RGB all-in-one liquid cooler, 16 gigs of G.Skill Trident Z RGB DDR4 memory running at 3200 speed with CAS latency 14, a Samsung 970 Pro 512 gig NVMe SSD, an EVGA Supernova G3 650 watt 80 plus gold rated power supply, and Windows 10 64-bit. All the tests were run in the Lian Li PC011 dynamic white tempered glass case with the side panels on, and I was running NVIDIA driver 419.35. For comparison GPUs, I have the GTX 1060 6GB, and that's the Gigabyte G1 gaming version, which is manufacturer overclocked, running at about 1950 MHz, the AMD Radeon RX 590 8GB, and the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2060. That said, here are the benchmarks. First test here is 3DMark Firestrike Ultra, and the 1660 scored 2962 with a graphics score of 2763. And here you might look at that RX 590 score and say, hey Paul, RX 590 is looking pretty good there. But also compare the 1660 Ti here, and bear in mind that this was the one test that was somewhat anomalous when it comes to my 1660 Ti tests, and that's not going to be represented as we move along. So next we have 3DMark Time Spy Extreme, which is a DirectX 12 test, and here we can see where NVIDIA has made some real big gains when it comes to asynchronous compute performance. 1660 scores 2710 with a graphics score of 2502, which beats out the RX 590 by about 380 points and sort of sits right between that RX 590 score and the GTX 1660 Ti. Here's 3DMark VRMARK Blue Room, which is a VR test. We have an average score as well as a frames per second score. The 1660 scored 1727, which handily beats out the RX 590, which comes in at 1355. And here also I'd like to point out the GTX 1060 6GB. If you got one of those a couple years ago and you're considering an upgrade, there's a pretty nice increase in performance here when you compare that to the 1660. Next is Ashes of the Singularity Escalation, also a DirectX 12 test. We're running at 2560 by 1440 here, and the GTX 1660 has 37.7 average frames per second, again beating out the RX 590 with 33.5, which had just barely beat out the 1066 gig with 33.4. If we move over to 1920 by 1080, the 1660 scores 42.7 average frames per second, again beating out the RX 590 with 38.7. Here's Shadow of the Tomb Raider, our last DirectX 12 test, and the GTX 1660 got 46 average frames per second, running at 2560 by 1440. RX 590 had a better performance here, but still wasn't able to beat it as it came in just 1 FPS short at 45. 1660 Ti had a nice lead here with 55 FPS. Of course, if you want the most performance out of any of these cards, you're going to have to go with the RTX 2060, but that costs $350. If we look at 1920 by 1080, the 1660 jumps up to 71 FPS on average and gains a little bit more of a lead over the RX 590. 590, which had 66 frames per second. Here's GTA 5, which remains one of the top 10 games played on Steam, which is why I continue to run benchmarks of it at 2560 by 1440. We have 75 average frames per second for the GTX 1660, which is a very nice performance. If you're playing on a 1440 monitor and you're looking for about a 60 Hz refresh rate, I think that would be a pretty good experience for you. Of course, if you move over to 1920 by 1080, you can get more frames, 113 average frames per second for the 1660, beating out the RX 590 with 95, and coming in just between the RX 590 and the 1660 Ti. Here's Overwatch, and at 2560 by 1440 we have 95 average frames per second for the GTX 1660. Again, just edging out that RX 590, which came in at 92 FPS. And here again, just a slight edge over the 1066 gigs. So it's going to depend on which game you're playing when it comes to performance improvements over the last generation of cards. Some will have more of a gain than others. If we move over to 1920 by 1080, we have 143 average frames per second for the GTX 1660, 136 average FPS for the RX 590. Our final test is Metro Exodus, and this is also DirectX 12, so I guess I lied to you guys earlier, but point being that at 2560 by 1440 we have 31.9 average frames per second for the 1660, and bear in mind this is a very intense test, not necessarily representative of the performance you would get in-game. It's going to be lower FPS in the benchmark run than the game itself, so just bear that in mind. But here is an example of a game where the RX 590 is shining a bit more and actually beats out the 1660, 34.5 average frames per second, and here was where the RX 590 also gave the 1660 Ti the greatest run for its money. If we move over to 1920 by 1080, we see similar performance, 41.5 average frames per second for the 1660. The RX 590 beats it out with 44.6 average FPS, but the 1660 Ti beats them both with 45.3. So to sum up, the GTX 1660 provides a lot of gaming performance at 1080 or 1440, and it beats out the RX 590 in most of my tests. Not all of them, but most of them, just as the 1660 Ti did. So for $220, I think this will definitely be the new go-to graphics card for budget builds, and we'll have to see if AMD is going to respond with price drops for the RX 570, 580, or 590. If you're wondering why I didn't include the 570 or 580 in my benchmark results, one, I literally only had today to make this video, and two, if it's beaten the 590, it's going to beat the 570 and 580 as well. I only tested 3 variants of the 1660 today though, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot more out there with varying features and price ranges, some of them with RGB and stuff too, but who cares about that? We want performance, not aesthetics. But the end result is a very viable new GPU option for people who are looking to spend a little over $200 with notable gains versus the previous generation. If I have any complaints about the GTX 1660 other than the name, which I'm still complaining about, 1660 Ti and everything, it would be that I think NVIDIA could have launched these GPUs last year sometime, since right now we're looking at Turing, and Turing without RTX, which is what these cards have, is basically Volta, which should have launched like last year. But anyway, I'll post links to these cards in the video description below. Let me know in the comments if you're going to pick up a 1660. If you are, which one you might be interested in. And of course, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. We'll see you guys next time.